You want me to sign this paper, Charlotte, or should I go tell your father the deal is off? That voice. Cold. Deliberate. Like a man who already knew the answer before he asked the question. Charlotte Bennett's pen hovered over the marriage contract, her jaw tight, her pride screaming at her to throw it back in his face. But the image of her father, gray-faced, trembling a debt collector's notice pinned to his door, kept her hand from moving. She signed. If this story moved something in you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Charlotte's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning of her wedding. Charlotte Bennett ironed her mother's old cream dress and told herself it didn't matter that she wasn't in love. Love was a luxury. Survival wasn't. She had known for 6 months that her father's debts had grown past the point of return. The Bennett farm, 40 acres. Her grandfather had broken from raw Colorado earth with nothing but a mule, and stubborn faith was 3 payments behind on its land note. The drought had taken 2 harvests. The third had barely come in at all. Her father, Robert Bennett, a man who had once stood 6 feet tall and carried himself like someone who believed the world owed him nothing, had spent the last winter shrinking. Every time a creditor knocked, Charlotte watched him lose another inch. She had tried everything she could think of. She took in laundry. She sold eggs and garden vegetables door to door. She wrote letters to distant cousins who never wrote back. She sat across from the bank manager, a round-faced man named Aldrich, who always smelled of hair oil and condescension, and she asked plainly without shame for an extension. Aldrich had folded his hands on his desk and said, "Miss Bennett, the bank is not a charity." She knew that. She had never asked for charity. She had asked for time. He hadn't given it. So when Harold Pruitt, her father's oldest friend, and the man who ran the feed store on the corner of 2nd and Main came to her one evening in February, with a name and a proposition, Charlotte had listened. She had sat very still at the kitchen table with her hands in her lap, and she had listened to every word. The name was Ethan Calloway. The proposition was marriage. "He's a decent man," Harold said carefully, the way a person speaks when they're not entirely sure they believe what they're saying. "Quiet. Keeps to himself. He's got that old ranch out past the Miller Creek Road, you know the one. Been there about 4 years. Charlotte knew the place. Everyone in Harlan County knew it. A sagging fence line. A cabin that looked held together by habit. A barn that leaned at an angle that made passing farmers wince. People said the roof leaked. People said the well was shallow. People said a lot of things about the Calloway place, none of them flattering. "Why would a man like that want to marry me?" she asked. Harold cleared his throat. "He came to me. Said he was looking for a wife. Said he wasn't looking for romance, just someone with good sense and a steady character." He paused. "I told him about you. You told him I'm desperate. I told him your family was in a hard season. There's a difference." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "What does he offer?" "He says he'll pay off the land note. Clear the debts. Your father keeps the farm. You go live at the Calloway place as his wife." She felt something cold settle in her chest. Not quite despair. Something more controlled than that. Something that had already done its grieving and come out the other side into pure quiet calculation. "And if I say no?" Harold didn't answer right away. He looked at the table. That silence told her everything. She said yes the next morning. She met Ethan Calloway for the first time 4 days before the wedding. Harold brought him to the house on a Wednesday afternoon. Charlotte came to the door expecting she wasn't sure what she expected. Someone rough. Someone with the look of a man who had failed at enough things to be willing to buy himself a wife. Someone she could feel quietly superior to, which would at least make the whole arrangement easier to bear. Ethan Calloway was not what she expected. He was tall, not unusually so, but tall enough that he had to angle himself slightly coming through the doorway. He had the kind of face that had been worked over by weather and time, all clean angles and sun-darkened skin, with dark eyes that moved across a room like they were reading it rather than just looking at it. His clothes were plain to the point of being threadbare. His hat was old. His boots had been resoled at least twice. He looked poor. There was simply no other word for it. He held out his hand and shook hers with one firm, unhurried movement and said, "Miss Bennet, I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me." His voice was low and even, unhurried, like a man who had long ago decided that the world would wait for him to finish his sentences. Charlotte shook his hand and said, "Mr. Calloway," and nothing else. Her father stood in the corner of the room looking at his own boots. They sat at the kitchen table. Harold poured coffee that nobody drank. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Ethan laid out the terms the same way he apparently did everything plainly without decoration. He would satisfy the Bennett land note in full. He would clear the outstanding feed debt and the medical bill from last autumn when Charlotte's father had been sick. In return, Charlotte would come to the ranch as his wife. She would have her own room if she wanted it. He expected nothing from her except honesty and a fair effort at making the arrangement work. "I'm not a man who makes promises I can't keep," he said, "and I don't ask for things that aren't freely given." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "And if it doesn't work, if we can't—" She searched for the right word. "Coexist. Then we find a dignified way to part," he said. "I won't hold you to something that's making you miserable, but I'd ask you to give it a real try before you decide." She studied him for a moment. There was something disconcerting about his calm. Most men, when they wanted something, showed it in the lean of their body, in the brightness of their eyes, in the slight uptick of performance that crept into their voice. Ethan Calloway showed none of that. He sat in her father's kitchen chair, like a man who was simply waiting to see what she decided with no particular anxiety about which way it went. She said, "All right." He nodded once. "All right." He left 20 minutes later. The debts were paid by Friday. The wedding took place on a Tuesday morning in the small white church on the edge of town. There were 11 people present: Charlotte's father, Harold Pruitt, the Reverend, a handful of neighbors who had come more out of curiosity than support. Nobody from the groom's side. Ethan apparently had no family left. Charlotte walked down the aisle in her mother's dress, let out at the seams, pressed within an inch of its life, and stood beside a man she had spoken to for a total of perhaps 40 minutes. The Reverend read the words. They spoke the responses. Ethan's voice was steady and clear. Charlotte's, she noted distantly, was also steady. She was surprised by that. When it was done, Ethan placed a plain silver band on her finger, clean and simple, and she would later notice very old, like something that had belonged to someone before her, and said quietly for her ears alone, "You don't owe me affection, just honesty." She looked at him. That same calm, readable face. That same unhurried patience. She said, "I can give you that." He nodded. "That's enough." They walked out of the church into dry July heat, and the 11 people present clapped in the polite, uncertain way people do when they're not sure what they're celebrating. Charlotte noticed as they stepped out into the light that 3 of the men who had been standing near the back of the churchmen she didn't recognize. Not townspeople well dressed in a quiet, understated way, gave Ethan a respectful nod as he passed. Not the kind of nod you gave a poor cowboy, the kind you gave someone you worked for. She filed that away somewhere in the back of her mind and said nothing. The ride to the ranch was 8 miles. Ethan drove the wagon. Charlotte sat beside him with her single trunk in the back and her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape move past. Neither of them spoke for the first 3 miles. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence which surprised her. It had the quality of 2 people who had agreed without saying so that small talk would be an insult to the situation. At the 4-mile mark, they passed the Harding property, one of the larger cattle operations in the county, run by a man named Daniel Harding, who Charlotte knew by reputation as someone important and difficult. Harding himself was standing at his fence line when they passed. When he saw the wagon, he lifted his hat. To Ethan. A slow, deliberate, respectful tip of the brim. Ethan returned it with a small nod. Charlotte turned to look at Ethan's profile. He was watching the road. "You know Daniel Harding?" she asked. "Some," Ethan said. "He tipped his hat to you." "Men do that sometimes." "Not to everyone," she said. He didn't answer. The road continued. The silence resumed. But Charlotte was paying attention now in a way she hadn't been before. 2 miles further, they passed through the edge of Millard, A small supply settlement with a general store, a livery, and a trading post. Ethan slowed the wagon to let a mule cart cross ahead of them, and the man driving the cart, older, weathered someone Charlotte didn't recognize, looked up and said, "Calloway, was hoping to run into you. Shipment came in ahead of schedule. You want me to hold it or send it on?" "Hold it," Ethan said. "I'll send somebody Thursday." The man nodded and moved on. Charlotte looked at Ethan. "What shipment?" "Fencing material," he said. "For the ranch." A pause. "For several places." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. She looked down at her hands, at the plain silver ring on her left hand. She thought about the way Daniel Harding had tipped his hat. She thought about the men at the back of the church. She thought about Harold Pruitt's careful, slightly evasive tone when he had described Ethan as a decent man. She thought, there is something here I am not seeing. And then she thought, he will tell me when he decides to. Or he won't. Either way, I am going to find out. The ranch was exactly as everyone had described it. The cabin was small and low-roofed, built from timber that had dried and aged to a deep gray. The barn needed paint. The paddock fence had been repaired in places with new wood that stood out bright against the weathered gray of the rest. The yard was neat. She hadn't expected that. Not pretty, not planted with anything decorative, but orderly. Tools hung where they belonged. The woodpile was stacked straight. The well housing was solid and recently reinforced. A man came out of the barn when the wagon pulled in, mid-40s, compact, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had worked outdoors their whole life. He nodded to Ethan and then looked at Charlotte with a respectful, measured assessment. "This is Joe Reller," Ethan said. "He runs the place when I'm not here." "Ma'am," Joe said, and touched the brim of his hat. "There are two other hands," Ethan said. "Pete and Cody. You'll meet them at supper." Charlotte climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. Not out of rudeness, but because waiting for help felt wrong. Felt like the beginning of a habit she didn't want, and looked at the cabin. "Can I see inside?" she asked. "It's your home," Ethan said simply. "You don't need to ask." She went inside. It was modest in the way that only deliberate modesty is modest. The furniture was plain, but well made. The floors were swept. The kitchen was clean. There were two rooms beyond the main living area, a bedroom on each side of a narrow hall. One clearly Ethan's with a narrow bed, a plain chest, a single framed photograph she couldn't see clearly from the doorway. The other, she understood, was meant for her. Someone had put a small bunch of wildflowers in a tin cup on the windowsill of her room. She stood and looked at that for a moment. She didn't know who had done it. She didn't ask. But she noted it. The way she was beginning to note everything. Supper that first evening was the four of them. Charlotte, Ethan, Joe, and the two hands, Pete, who was young and earnest, and kept his eyes on his plate, and Cody, who was older with a scar across his chin, and a blunt, friendly way of speaking, that Charlotte immediately appreciated, because it meant she always knew exactly where she stood with him. The food was plain. Beans and salt pork and cornbread that was good, better than she had expected. Joe, it turned out, did the cooking. "You're better at this than I am," Charlotte told him honestly. "Most people are better at most things than a man who burns water," Cody said pleasantly. "That's true," Joe said without looking up from his plate. Ethan said nothing, but Charlotte caught the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The memory of one. After supper, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Joe had disappeared into the kitchen, Charlotte and Ethan sat at opposite ends of the table with the remains of the meal between them, and Charlotte decided that if she was going to spend any length of time in this man's company, she might as well start as she intended to go on. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Ethan," he said. "We're married." "Ethan." She folded her hands on the table. "I want you to know that I am not a woman who pretends not to notice things. And there are things about your situation that don't add up to the picture everyone in town has of you." He looked at her across the table. His expression didn't change, but his attention, the quality of it, shifted, sharpened. "What things?" he asked. "Daniel Harding tipped his hat to you like you were someone he reports to. The man in Millard was managing a shipment for you that involved enough material to need a team to move it. The bank manager in town, I saw his face when we drove past. He recognized you, and he stood up straighter. Not friendlier, straighter. She held his gaze. Poor men don't get that. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. You're observant, he said. I'm practical, she said. There's a difference. Another pause. Then, there are things I'll tell you in time. Not because I don't trust you, I married you, which is as much trust as a man can show, but because some of what I carry is better shared carefully. Charlotte looked at him steadily. I can accept that. For now. She paused. But I want you to know that I'm not going to stop noticing. I wouldn't want you to, he said. She wasn't sure what she had expected him to say, but it wasn't that. The next 3 weeks were a lesson in revision, every assumption Charlotte had made about her new life turned out to be exactly half right, which was somehow more disorienting than being entirely wrong. She had expected poverty. She found modesty. She had expected roughness. She found a kind of spare functional order that grew on her against her will. She had expected to feel trapped. She felt instead like someone who had been handed an incomplete map of a foreign country and was slowly, painstakingly filling in the blank spaces. Ethan rose before dawn every morning. He worked, really worked alongside his hands, not standing back issuing orders through most of the day. He came in at midday for a meal, ate quietly, said what needed saying, and went back out. He was never idle. He was also never frantic, never irritable, never the kind of man who brought the weight of his workday inside with him at night. Charlotte, who had nothing particular to do with her hands, in those first days, found herself looking for ways to be useful. She reorganized the kitchen. She mended a pile of shirts that had clearly been waiting for someone's attention. She started a kitchen garden in a patch of dirt behind the cabin that got good morning light. Nobody told her to. Nobody thanked her for it in a way that suggested it was remarkable. Joe just said, "Smart spot for it," and went back to his work, which from a man like Joe, she was beginning to understand was the highest form of praise. On the 4th day, a man came to the ranch asking for Ethan. Charlotte answered the door. The man was middle-aged, well-dressed for the county, carrying a leather document case. He had the look of someone from a city office who had been practicing looking comfortable in the country for so long, he almost managed it. "Is Mr. Calloway available?" he asked. "He's in the south field," she said. "I can take a message." The man hesitated. "I have some papers that need his signature. They're time-sensitive. Regarding the—" He stopped himself, looked at her carefully. "Regarding a land matter." "A land matter," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Which land?" Another hesitation. "The parcels adjacent to the Miller Creek Road, and the 3 tracks north of the county line." Charlotte kept her face perfectly neutral. She knew enough about this county's geography to know that the parcels adjacent to Miller Creek Road alone comprised several hundred acres of good grazing land. The 3 tracks north of the county line she knew nothing about specifically, but the way the man said it, with the careful understatement of someone accustomed to handling things that didn't bear too much public attention, told her they were significant. "I'll tell him you came," she said. "Your name? Morrison. Franklin Morrison. From Morrison and Gray in Denver." Denver. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," she said. She took his card. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway of the small gray cabin on the rundown ranch outside Harlan, Colorado, holding a business card from a law firm in Denver, and she thought, who did I marry? She told Ethan about Morrison at supper that evening. His face didn't change when she mentioned the name, or the Denver firm, or the parcels she had listed as accurately as she could remember them. He listened, and then he said, "I'll ride into town and find him tomorrow." "Are those your lands?" she asked. A pause. "Some of them." "Some of them," she repeated. "Charlotte." He said her name like it was something he was being careful with. "I told you I'd tell you things in time, and I told you I wouldn't stop noticing." They looked at each other across the table, the lamp between them threw long, quiet shadows. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Should I be?" He thought about that with the same unhurried seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "No," he said finally. "You shouldn't." Then we're fine, she said, and went back to her supper. But her mind was running hard and fast beneath the surface of her calm, assembling pieces into a shape she couldn't yet see clearly. Morrison from Denver. Land parcels measured in hundreds of acres. A cattle buyer from the eastern markets who had arrived 2 days ago and spoken to Ethan for 3 hours in the barn with the door closed. A telegram that had come to the house yesterday morning and that Ethan had read and pocketed with no comment. She had married a man everyone in town thought was barely surviving. And something every instinct she had, every piece of evidence she kept quietly, carefully collecting told her that the town was very, very wrong. On a Thursday afternoon, near the end of her 3rd week at the ranch, Charlotte rode into town to buy thread and a few supplies she needed for the garden. She tied her horse outside Aldrich's bank, not to go in, just because it was a convenient post, and as she came back out with her parcels, she nearly walked directly into the bank manager himself. Aldrich was coming down the steps, and he pulled up short when he saw her. Something moved through his face, not quite guilt, not quite embarrassment, but something in that family. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. The name landed strangely. She hadn't heard it said aloud before. "Mr. Aldrich," she said pleasantly. He cleared his throat. "Settling in out at the ranch, are you?" "Quite well, thank you." He nodded, fidgeted slightly with his hat brim. "Your husband." He stopped. Tried again. "Mr. Calloway is he's a man of very good standing." Charlotte looked at him calmly. "Is he?" "Yes. Yes, indeed." Aldrich seemed to be choosing his words with unusual care. "One of the finest accounts in this region, actually. Perhaps in—" He caught himself again. "Well, yes, good standing." He put his hat back on. "Good day to you, Mrs. Calloway." He walked away at a pace that was just below undignified hurrying. Charlotte stood on the steps of the bank in the dry afternoon heat and thought, one of the finest accounts in this region. She looked down at her plain cotton dress, at the simple basket of thread and garden stakes in her hands. She thought about the sagging fence line, the cabin held together by habit, the boots resoled twice, and she thought, he is hiding something enormous. The question wasn't whether she was right, the question was why, and who knew, and what or who was pushing to uncover it. She would not have to wait long for the answers to begin. 3 days later, a man named Silas Crow rode into Harlan County, and nothing was the same afterward. Silas Crow arrived on a Sunday, which Charlotte would later think was fitting, because men who wanted to look righteous always picked a Sunday. She heard about him before she saw him. Joe came in from town that afternoon with supplies and a look on his face that she had not seen before. Something tightened down, and careful the way a man looks when he's carrying news he isn't sure how to hand over. "There's a cattle baron come into the county," Joe said, setting his parcels on the kitchen table. "Name of Crow, Silas Crow. Bought the old Delaney property on the north end, all 400 acres of it. Cash." Ethan, who was sitting at the table with a piece of harness leather he'd been working on, didn't look up. "When?" "Papers filed Friday. Word got around today." "Who's he brought with him?" "6 men that I counted. More maybe. They're staying at the Harlan Hotel, taking up half the floor." Joe paused. "He had a meeting with Aldrich this morning. Ran 2 hours." Now Ethan looked up. His eyes were level and still. "Did he? Whole town's talking about it. They say he's got plans, big ones." Joe set his hat on the counter. "They say he's looking to expand." Ethan went back to the harness leather. His hands moved with the same unhurried steadiness as always. But something in the set of his jaw had changed, and Charlotte, watching from the doorway, caught it. "Who is he?" she asked. Both men looked at her. Joe deferred to Ethan with a slight shift of his weight. Ethan set the leather down. "A man who builds things by taking them from other people," he said, "and then finds legal language to make it look like they were his to begin with. You know him." "I know of him. He operated in Kansas 4 years ago. Before that, Nebraska." A pause. "He leaves counties poorer than he finds them." Charlotte came fully into the kitchen. "And now he's here." "And now he's here," Ethan agreed. She looked at him. Is that a problem for us? Ethan picked the harness back up. It will be a problem for a lot of people, he said. We'll see. It was not an answer. But it was. She was beginning to understand exactly as much as Ethan Calloway ever said before he was ready to say more. She let it go. For that night. By morning she had reason to let it go a little less easily. Cody came in at breakfast with the news that the Hargrove family, who ran a modest cattle operation 12 miles east, had received a visit from two of Crow's men the previous afternoon. The men had presented a document, an offer to purchase, they called it. Though Cody used a different word and informed old Tom Hargrove that the offer was good for 30 days, after which Crow's lawyers would be reviewing certain irregularities in the Hargrove land title. What irregularities? Charlotte asked. That's what Tom asked, Cody said. They told him his surveyor from 1874 had made errors that put his eastern boundary in dispute. He shook his head. Tom's had that land 22 years. His surveyor's been dead 15. There's nobody left to argue the measurements. Charlotte looked at Ethan. Can they do that? They can try, Ethan said. Whether it holds is a different question. But Tom Hargrove doesn't have the money to fight it in court. Ethan said nothing. Which was, she had learned its own kind of answer. She pushed her chair back from the table and stood. This is how he works, she said. Not a question. He finds the people who can't fight back, and he manufactures a reason to take what they have. Yes, Ethan said simply. And the people who could fight back don't know enough yet, he said, to know they should. She looked at him for a long, measured moment. There was something she wanted to say, and she wasn't sure yet if she had earned the right to say it. She was still a woman 3 weeks into a marriage built on practicality and careful silences, and there were things about this man she did not yet understand, but she said it anyway. You know more than you're telling me. About Crow. About what he's actually after. She held his gaze. And I think whatever he's after has something to do with you. The table went quiet. Joe studied his coffee cup. Cody became very interested in the window. Ethan looked at her with those dark, still eyes. And for just a moment, one crack in the surface, she saw something move behind them. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Something that looked almost like relief, the way a man looks when someone finally says the thing he's been waiting for someone to say. Give me a little more time, he said quietly. I'll give you what you need, she said. But not forever. He nodded. Once. The way he did when a thing had been settled. She picked up her coffee cup and walked out to the kitchen garden, and she stood in the morning air and thought about a man who hid his business behind a sagging fence line, and another man who had ridden into this county on a Sunday with 6 hired men and a lawyer on retainer, and the slowly clarifying sense that she was standing in the middle of something much larger than a struggling ranch marriage. She had better pay attention. She always had. The following 2 weeks moved fast and darkly. Crow's men spread through Harlan County, the way a stain spreads through cloth slowly, and then all at once, and by the time you noticed how far it had gone, it had already reached the edges. 3 more families received the same visit the Hargroves had. The Putnam family, who ran sheep on the western end. Old Mrs. Reyes, a widow who had held her land alone since her husband died in 1879. The Garfield brothers, who owned 200 acres of river bottom that everyone in the county knew was worth twice what the rest of the land around it fetched. Each visit followed the same pattern. A document. A friendly tone that didn't quite reach the eyes. The mention of irregularities. The reminder that legal disputes were expensive and slow, and wouldn't it be simpler for everyone to come to an arrangement now? Mrs. Reyes, who was 61 and had buried a husband and 2 sons, and survived a plains winter that killed half the cattle in the region, told Crow's men to get off her property and take their documents with them. They did. They came back 3 days later with a county deputy and a surveyor, and spent 4 hours on her land taking measurements she hadn't authorized and couldn't legally stop. Charlotte heard about it from the Putnam wife, Sarah, who came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning in a state of contained, trembling fury that Charlotte recognized because she had felt it herself in a different kitchen in what felt now like a different life. They're going to take everything, Sarah said. She was a small woman, practical and sun-hardened, not given to dramatics, which made her fear more frightening, not less. Martin's talking to a lawyer in Denver, but the man wants $200 just to look at the papers. We don't have $200. We don't have 20. Charlotte brought her inside and put coffee on and sat across from her at the table and let her talk. And while Sarah talked, Charlotte's mind was running, sorting, connecting. $200 for a Denver lawyer. The Putnams didn't have it. The Hargroves didn't have it. Mrs. Reyes certainly didn't have it. But Morrison, Franklin Morrison from Morrison and Gray in Denver, who had come to this ranch with time-sensitive papers for Ethan Calloway regarding land matters. She said, "Sarah, go home. Don't sign anything. Not one word on any paper they put in front of you. Tell Martin the same." Sarah looked at her. "Charlotte, I don't think—" "Don't sign," Charlotte said again. "Give me a few days." Sarah left. Charlotte sat at the table alone for a while, organizing what she knew and what she suspected into two clear columns in her mind. Then she went to find her husband, who was in the barn, working alongside Pete on something mechanical that she didn't try to understand. She stood in the doorway until he looked up. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Alone." Pete took himself off with the efficiency of a man who had worked around perceptive people long enough to know when to disappear. Charlotte stepped inside. She looked at Ethan directly and said, "Sarah Putnam was here this morning. They can't afford a lawyer. Mrs. Reyes can't afford a lawyer. The Hargroves can't afford one. And Crow knows it. He's specifically targeting the people who have no legal recourse." She paused. "Morrison from Denver. He handles your legal affairs." Ethan said nothing. "I'm not asking you to explain everything today," she said. "I'm asking you one question, and I want you to answer it straight. Can you help these people?" The barn was quiet. Outside, Pete was making just enough noise to demonstrate he wasn't listening. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes." "Then why haven't you—" "Because the moment I do," he said carefully, "Crow will know exactly what he's been trying to find out for 3 years. And that changes things considerably." Charlotte absorbed that. "He's been looking for you." "He's been looking for something I have," Ethan said. "There's a difference." "What is it he's looking for?" A long pause. Ethan set down the tool in his hand and looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first time in her father's kitchen, reading her, measuring her with that same quality of attention that felt less like surveillance and more like genuine careful respect. "My father built something," he said at last. "Over 40 years, quietly, without drawing attention. Land contracts, freight partnerships, grazing rights across 3 states. He believed that wealth held quietly was wealth that served people rather than controlling them." A pause. "When he died, he left it to me. And I continued what he started." Charlotte was very still. "How much?" she asked. He told her. She sat down on the nearest hay bale. She had suspected. She had collected evidence like a woman building a case. She had prepared herself, she thought, for a significant number. She had not prepared herself for that number. "You live like this," she said slowly, deliberately. "My father used to say that a man's character is who he is when nobody's keeping score," Ethan said. "I believed him. And Crow has known for years that someone in this region is holding a very large amount of land and capital that isn't showing up in the normal places. He's been working county by county trying to identify it." He paused. When he started pressuring small landowners, he was doing 2 things: taking what he could get, and flushing out whoever had reason to protect them. Charlotte looked up at him. "He wants to provoke you into revealing yourself." "Yes, and if you stay quiet, he keeps taking land from families who have nothing." "Yes. And if you act, he knows where to aim." "Yes." She thought about that, about the geometry of it, about a man clever enough to build a hidden fortune for 30 years, sitting across from a man clever enough to use innocence as leverage to find it. "Well," she said finally quietly, "that's a problem." "It is," Ethan agreed, "but it's not an impossible one." She stood up. "What would it take to protect the Putnams and the Hargroves and Mrs. Reyes without revealing who's behind it?" Ethan looked at her with that expression she was beginning to know, the one that wasn't quite surprise, because he had already suspected she was capable of this, but that was something close to it anyway. It would take careful legal work, he said, and someone with no obvious connection to me doing the asking. Charlotte squared her shoulders. I'm a new wife from a different family. Nobody in this county has had 6 months to connect me to your affairs. She held his gaze. Let me go see Morrison. The silence stretched between them. Then Ethan said, You'd need to understand enough of the legal structure to speak to him usefully. Then start explaining, she said. We have time before supper. Something shifted in his face. Not the memory of a smile this time. Something more direct than that. He started explaining. It took 3 evenings. Each night after supper, when the hands had gone and the lamp was burning low, and the county outside the cabin window was doing whatever the county did in the dark. Ethan laid out pieces of what he had inherited and built, and Charlotte listened with the focused, retentive attention she had used all her life to understand things she wasn't supposed to need to understand. She asked questions, sharp ones, practical ones, the kind that came from genuine comprehension rather than performance, and he answered them with the same plainness he brought to everything. By the 3rd night, she had a working map in her head. Not the full picture. She suspected she might not see the full picture for a long time, but enough. Enough to act. She went to Denver on a Thursday. She told the hands she was visiting a cousin. She took the stage from Harlan to the rail junction and the train from there, and she arrived in Morrison's office at 2:30 in the afternoon, unannounced, and told his secretary that she was Charlotte Calloway, and that she needed 30 minutes of Mr. Morrison's time on a matter of some urgency. Morrison came out of his office 12 minutes later, and the look on his face when he saw her, the sudden sharp attention, the reassessment told her that he already knew who she was. Mrs. Calloway, he said carefully. Mr. Morrison, she said. Shall we? They sat. She was organized, precise, and quick. She laid out the situation with the Putnams, the Hargroves, and Mrs. Reyes, and the legal mechanism she had discussed with Ethan and what she needed Morrison to do and the timeline. She did not mention Ethan's name. She spoke as though she were acting on her own initiative in her capacity as a landowner's wife with legitimate legal standing in county matters. Morrison listened. His expression moved through several things. Professional caution assessment, something that might have been admiration. And when she finished, he said, You understand what you're asking me to do has implications that extend beyond these 3 cases. I understand that, she said. And you're prepared for those implications. We are, she said. Though we landed quietly between them. She didn't elaborate on it. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I'll need to make some arrangements. Give me 4 days. You have 3? She said pleasantly and stood up. She was back at the ranch by Friday evening. Ethan was sitting on the porch step when she rode in, waiting in the way. He waited without urgency, without visible worry, but present, alert. She swung down from the horse and handed the reins to Pete and walked up to where he sat. Morrison's handling it, she said. 3 days. He looked up at her. The last light of the day was behind her, and she couldn't read his expression entirely, but she heard something in the quietness of the moment that she hadn't heard before. You didn't have to do that, he said. No, she agreed. I didn't. She looked at him steadily. But Mrs. Reyes is 61 years old, and she's been holding that land alone for 11 years, and nobody is going to take it from her because a man in an expensive coat found a dead surveyor to blame. A pause. Thank you, he said, quietly, directly, the way he said everything. She nodded once, the way she was learning to nod. Then she went inside. She was halfway through heating the leftover stew when she heard a knock at the front door. She went to answer it herself. Standing on the porch was a man she didn't know, heavy-set, well-dressed, with a smile that his eyes weren't participating in. Good evening, he said pleasantly. I'm looking for Mr. Calloway. I'm Silas Crow. Charlotte looked at him. She kept her face as neutral as Riverstone. Mr. Calloway is occupied, she said. I'm his wife. What can I do for you? Crow's eyes moved over her quickly, assessing, calculating, filing away. Just a neighborly visit, he said. I like to introduce myself to the people I'll be doing business with. My husband doesn't have any business planned with you, Mr. Crow. Not yet, he said and smiled. Good evening, Mrs. Calloway. He tipped his hat. He walked away. Charlotte stood in the doorway and watched him go. And what she felt was not fear exactly. It was something colder and more useful than fear. It was the recognition that the man who had just smiled at her from her own porch had come to look at what Ethan was protecting. And she had just become part of what he saw. Behind her, Ethan appeared in the hallway. That was Crow, she said without turning around. I know, Ethan said. I heard. He came to measure us. Yes, she turned. Then he's already moving faster than we thought. Ethan's jaw was set. His eyes were calm in that particular way that meant the opposite of calm underneath. Morrison needs to move in 2 days, he said. Not 3. I'll send a telegram in the morning, she said. She went back to the stew. Ethan sat at the table. For the first time since she had come to this ranch, the silence between them didn't feel like two strangers being careful. It felt like two people who had without entirely meaning to chosen the same side of something. It was not what she had expected from a marriage made of necessity and quiet desperation. But then nothing about Ethan Calloway was what anyone expected, and Silas Crow, for all his careful calculations, had just made the mistake of walking onto this porch and letting her see his face. She would not forget it. She never forgot things that mattered. And this she understood now, with the full weight of it settling into her bones, mattered enormously. Morrison moved in 2 days, not 3. The legal filings hit the Harlan County Clerk's office on a Saturday morning, which meant the deputy on duty had to pull the county recorder out of his weekend to process them, which meant that by Saturday afternoon the news had spread the way. News always spreads in a small county, unevenly with embellishment, and faster than anyone who wanted to control it would have liked. Charlotte heard about it from Sarah Putnam, who rode over before noon with her husband Martin, and a look on her face that had shed its fear and replaced it with something cautious and tentative, like a woman who has been promised something and is afraid to believe it. There are legal protections filed on our land, Martin said. He was a straightforward man, not given to drama, and the bewilderment in his voice was all the more striking for it. On the Hargroves, too, and Mrs. Reyes. All of them filed through a Denver firm, Morrison and Gray. He looked at Charlotte carefully. Charlotte, do you know anything about this? Charlotte poured him coffee. Drink that, she said. You look like you haven't slept. Do you know anything about this? He said again. She looked at him steadily. I know that nobody is taking your land, she said. That's what matters right now. Martin stared at her. Sarah put her hand over her mouth. And then Sarah Putnam, who Charlotte had never once seen cry in 7 years of knowing her, pressed her fingers hard against her lips, and her eyes went bright, and she looked at the ceiling until she had herself back under control. Whoever did this, Sarah said very quietly, tell them thank you. If I see anyone worth thanking, Charlotte said, I will. They left an hour later. Charlotte went to find Ethan. He was in the north field. She didn't need to say much. She told him about the Putnams' visit, and he listened and nodded, and then he said, Crow knows by now. What will he do? He'll push harder, Ethan said. When a man like Crow meets resistance, he didn't expect his first instinct isn't to retreat. It's to escalate. Then we should expect something this week. Yes, Ethan said. We should. He was right. He was right in 2 days. The escalation didn't come to the ranch. It came to town, and it came in the form of a public meeting that Crow organized at the Harlan Hotel on a Monday evening, which he framed through notices posted at the general store and the feed supply and the church door as a community discussion about land development and regional prosperity. The kind of language that sounded like an invitation and functioned like a summons. Charlotte went. She told Ethan she was going before he could say anything about it, and he looked at her with that level assessing gaze and said, Take Cody with you. I don't need Charlotte. He said her name quietly. Take Cody. She took Cody. The hotel meeting room held perhaps 60 people. Charlotte recognized most of them, farmers, ranchers, tradespeople, a few of the town's professionals. Everyone who had something to lose, and everyone who was curious about the man who had arrived with money and plans and 6 hired men. The room had the quality of a crowd that is present at something it suspects may be important, and hasn't yet decided whether to be hopeful or afraid. Crow stood at the front of the room, and he was, Charlotte admitted to herself, impressive in a way that was entirely surface. He was broad-shouldered and silver-haired, and he spoke with the confident ease of a man who had made these speeches many times and knew which words landed and which ones didn't. He talked about growth, about opportunity, about the future of Harlan County and the importance of working together toward it. He had a gift for making acquisitions sound like generosity. Charlotte watched the room while he talked. She watched faces shift from wary to interested to something softer. The particular softening that happens when a man who seems powerful tells frightened people that their problems are not their fault, and he has the solution. Then Crow said, "Of course, this kind of development requires clear, clean land titles. Any property with clouded ownership or disputed surveys is a liability for the whole region. I've brought the resources to resolve those disputes fairly and efficiently." And there it was, dressed in 3 sentences of reasonable-sounding concern. Charlotte raised her hand. Crow looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, recognition, calculation, and then the smooth professional reset that a man like Crow could do almost instantaneously. "Mrs. Calloway," he said pleasantly, "I didn't expect to see you this evening." "I imagine not," she said. "I have a question about the disputed surveys you mentioned." "Of course. The Reyes property. Mrs. Reyes has held her land for 23 years under a deed filed with the county in 1864. Her survey was conducted by a licensed county surveyor whose credentials were validated at the time of filing. On what legal basis are you claiming the survey is in error?" The room went very quiet. Crow smiled, the kind of smile that indicates displeasure without showing it. "These are technical matters best handled through proper legal channels, Mrs. Calloway." "They are," she agreed. "Which is why I'm curious why your men are conducting unauthorized surveys on her property, rather than filing a formal challenge through the county court, which would be the proper legal channel." Someone in the back of the room said low enough that it was meant only for the person beside them, but loud enough that Charlotte heard it clearly. "She's right. That's the proper way." Crow's smile didn't waver, but his eyes had gone cold. "I appreciate the question," he said. "I'd be happy to discuss specifics privately." "The people in this room have been receiving visits from your men," Charlotte said, still pleasant, still clear. "I think they'd be interested in the specifics right here." The room stirred. People looked at each other. Cody, standing near the door, had a look on his face that Charlotte would describe later as professionally neutral, but personally delighted. Crow looked at Charlotte with the particular focus of a man filing information away for later use. Then he said calmly, "You're Calloway's wife." "I am," she said. "And Calloway sent you here." "My husband is busy," she said. "I came on my own. Women do that sometimes." A ripple of something, not quite laughter, not quite approval, but something in that family moved through the room. Crow let it pass. He returned to his speech smooth as water closing over a stone, and Charlotte sat down and let him, because she had accomplished what she came for. She had made the room ask questions it hadn't thought to ask. She had made them look at the man behind the friendly language. On the way home, Cody rode beside her for 2 miles without speaking. Then he said, "You know he's going to come at the ranch now." "Yes," Charlotte said. "You're not worried?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm worried," she said. "But worried and afraid are different things." Cody was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, when Ethan said he was getting married, I thought—" He stopped himself. "What did you think?" she asked. "I thought it was going to be complicated," he said. Then carefully, "I was wrong about what kind of complicated." She laughed. It surprised her, genuine, sudden, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to laugh. "That's almost a compliment, Cody." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Almost." Ethan was awake when she got home. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp and a set of papers, and he looked up when she came in and waited. She told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He'll move against us this week, probably through the bank." "Aldrich." Aldrich has always been squeamish about choosing sides, Ethan said. Crow will pressure him. Try to call in lines of credit, create the appearance of financial instability. Charlotte sat down across from him. Can he do that? He can try, Ethan said. Our position is sound, but it creates noise, and noise creates doubt, and doubt gives him room to operate. She looked at the papers spread between them. She recognized Morrison's letterhead on some of them. Other documents she didn't recognize, dense formal, the kind of language that carried weight because of its precision rather than its volume. Ethan, she said, it's time. He met her eyes. You've protected this long enough, she said. These people are your neighbors. Crow is using their vulnerability to find you anyway. Every day you wait, someone loses something. She kept her voice even and direct. You told me your father believed wealth held quietly served people rather than controlling them. But wealth held so quietly that people lose their homes while you watch, that's not service. That's hiding. The silence that followed was the longest one he had ever left between them. She didn't fill it. She had learned that about him, that his silences weren't absence. They were thinking. Finally, Ethan said, if I step forward, everything changes. Yes, she said, for the better. It won't be clean. Crow won't go quietly. I know. It could get dangerous. Ethan. She leaned forward slightly. I grew up watching my father shrink from debt collectors for 3 years. I signed a marriage contract to save a farm I loved. I rode to Denver by myself to see a lawyer I'd never met and told him what to do. I stood up in a room full of this county's people and challenged a man with 6 hired guns to explain his legal strategy. She paused. I am not fragile. Something moved through his face. Something real and unguarded there and gone quickly, but she caught it. No, he said quietly. You're not. He gathered the papers from the table. He held them for a moment, looking at them. Then he said, I need to send Morrison a letter tonight, and I need to write to the federal land office in Denver. Tell me what to write, she said. I'm faster. He looked at her. You'd do that. We're wasting time, she said, and pulled the lamp closer. They worked until past midnight. Charlotte wrote while Ethan dictated, and somewhere in the 3rd hour, sitting across from each other, with papers between them, and the night pressing quiet against the windows, she became aware that what they were doing had a shape that was different from anything she had done before. Not just practical. Something more. She pushed the thought aside. There was work to do. The letters went out the next morning. Crow moved the day after, exactly as Ethan had predicted. A representative from the bank arrived at the ranch mid-morning. Not Aldrich himself, which Charlotte noted as significant, because a man who sends his representative instead of coming himself is a man who already suspects he's on the losing side of something. The representative was young, nervous, and carried a letter citing a technical review of outstanding notes that gave the bank the right to request a financial accounting within 30 days. Joe brought him to the porch and stood nearby without appearing. To which was something Joe did with a quiet professionalism Charlotte had come to rely on. Ethan read the letter. He handed it to Charlotte without comment. She read it. Tell Mr. Aldrich, Ethan said to the young man, that our accounting will be filed with the county court within the week, as will our documentation of this bank's recent communications with Silas Crow. The young man's face went pale in the specific way of someone who has just realized he was handed a letter he didn't fully understand the consequences of. Sir, I was just asked to deliver. I know, Ethan said, not unkindly. You can tell Mr. Aldrich I said that. Those are his words to receive, not yours. The man left faster than he'd arrived. Charlotte looked at Ethan. You have documentation of the Crow-Aldrich communication. Morrison has been thorough, Ethan said simply. How long has Morrison been watching Crow? A pause. 2 years. Charlotte stared at him. 2 years. When Crow started working his way toward Colorado, I asked Morrison to track his methods, document his patterns. Ethan's voice was level. I knew eventually he'd come here. You've been preparing for this? Yes. She processed that. So when Joe told you Crow had arrived, you already had a case built. A partial one. Enough to protect the county's landowners, not enough yet to remove him permanently. What do you need for that? A public proceeding, Ethan said, where the documentation is entered into official record. Somewhere Crow can't bury it or buy it back. A county hearing, she said. Yes. Can you get one called? With the federal land office involved, yes. That's what the letter last night was for. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, fitting the pieces together. The preparation. The patience. The years of holding things quietly until the moment required action. She thought about the man she had ridden away from that church with whom she had believed she was rescuing from her own desperation, and she thought about what it meant that he had already been building toward this moment long before she arrived. You were never going to let him win, she said. No, Ethan said. You were just waiting for the right time. I was waiting until I could win it completely, he said. Partial victories and things like this leave room for damage. I wanted it done. She looked at him for a long moment. And me, she asked. Was I part of that? The question was direct, and she meant it to be. It sat between them without apology. Ethan met her eyes. No, he said. You were not part of any calculation. A pause. Harold told me about your family. I asked him who in this county had a woman with real intelligence and real backbone and real need. He named you. Another pause. I took a chance. Charlotte held his gaze. That's honest. I try to be. She nodded once. Then, the county hearing. When? Morrison is pushing for next week. If the federal letter moves fast enough. Make sure it does, she said. Crow is going to figure out what we're building before it's finished. We don't want to give him time to dismantle it. She was right about that. She was right in less than 24 hours. Because the next morning, Tom Hargrove's barn burned down. Nobody could prove it was deliberate. The deputy came out, looked at the ash, and wrote his report in the careful, neutral language of a man who preferred not to have opinions that cost him anything. Tom Hargrove stood in the yard and looked at what remained of a barn his grandfather had built, and he was too old and too tired and too hollowed out to cry. He just stood there. Charlotte heard about it by midday. She got on her horse without telling anyone where she was going and rode to the Hargrove property. She found Tom in the yard where he had apparently been standing since morning, and she got off her horse and walked up beside him and stood there with him for a while without saying anything. Then she said, Tom, did you sign anything? No, he said. No, I didn't sign. Good. She turned to face him directly. Tom, look at me. He did slowly with the eyes of a man who has been beaten by something he couldn't fight. This is not the end. I need you to hear that. Charlotte, there is a county hearing being called, she said. Next week, maybe sooner. Every piece of what Crow has done, the surveys, the intimidation, the forged boundary claims, goes into official record. Federal land investigators are being brought in. She paused. But I need you to hold, just a little longer. Tom looked at her for a long time. He was a man in his 60s, with the specific weariness of someone who had worked hard his whole life and been worn down by it rather than built up. But underneath that somewhere, there was still a man who had held 22 years of land and fed his family on it, and stood up to a deputy this morning and not signed a single thing. You're serious, he said. I am completely serious, she said. He looked back at the ash where his barn had been. They can burn a barn, he said slowly. Can't burn land. No, Charlotte said. They can't. She rode home with a hard, clear anger settled in her chest. Not the hot kind that made mistakes, the cold kind that made decisions. Ethan was on the porch when she rode in. He saw her face. Hargrove's barn, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She swung down. We are out of time for patience, Ethan. If Crow is burning property, the next thing he burns will be someone's livelihood completely. She looked at him squarely. Call the hearing, now. Whatever Morrison needs from you to make it happen this week, give it to him. Ethan was already moving toward the house. I'll send a telegram this afternoon. Send two, she said. One to Morrison, one directly to the federal land office. Charlotte. He stopped in the doorway and turned back. The last light caught the lines of his face, the steadiness in it, and something else. Something that had not been there before, or that she had not been positioned to see before. The hearing will expose everything. My name, the holdings, all of it. I know, she said. Once that happens, this life. He gestured slightly, meaning the ranch, the modesty, the careful anonymity he had maintained for years. It changes. She looked at him steadily. Was this life making you happy? The question surprised him. She could see that the slight crack in the composure, the pause before he could answer. It was sufficient, he said finally. That's not the same thing, she said quietly. Send the telegrams. She went inside. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard and the paddock and the sagging fence that somehow now she saw differently than she had on the day she'd arrived. Not as evidence of poverty, but as evidence of a choice deliberate and principled. And perhaps she thought also a little lonely. She understood lonely. She had spent 3 years of her life being useful to her family and invisible to herself, and she understood what it cost. Ethan sent the telegrams that afternoon. The hearing was set for Thursday. And on Wednesday evening, a man arrived at the ranch who Charlotte had never seen before. Well-dressed federal badge on his coat eyes that had the particular quality of someone accustomed to finding things that other people had tried very hard to bury. He introduced himself as Agent Thomas Hale, federal land investigator out of the Denver office. He shook Ethan's hand. He shook Charlotte's hand. He sat at their kitchen table and drank Joe's coffee and said, Mr. Calloway, I've reviewed the materials your attorney forwarded to us. I want to be direct with you. Crow's pattern here matches what we've documented in Kansas and Nebraska. We have been building a federal case for 18 months. He paused. Your documentation fills the gap we've been missing. Ethan was very still. What gap? The financial trail, Hale said. We can prove the intimidation, the unauthorized surveys, the pressure campaigns. But Crow has always kept his money clean enough that the fraud charges couldn't stick. Your documentation of the banking communications and of the land transactions in Kansas specifically closes that gap. Charlotte looked at Ethan. He was looking at Hale with the same steady, unhurried attention he brought to everything. But she could see, because she had been paying attention for weeks now, that something beneath that steadiness had shifted. Something that felt like relief. What do you need from me at the hearing? Ethan asked. Everything, Hale said. On record, including who you are and what you hold. A pause. All right, Ethan said. Hale looked at Charlotte. Mrs. Calloway, your appearance at the hotel meeting was reported to our office by 2 separate witnesses. The questions you raised are consistent with what we've been tracking. He paused. You're a perceptive woman. I've had reason to be, she said. He nodded, finished his coffee, stood to go. At the door, he turned back. Mr. Calloway, Crow knows the hearing has been called. My office has received word that he's bringing 4 lawyers and intends to challenge the jurisdiction of the proceeding. He looked at Ethan directly. He's going to try to discredit you personally before you can put the documents on record. Whatever he can find about your family, your history, your methods, he will use it. Ethan held the man's gaze. Let him try, he said. Hale left. The door closed. The kitchen went quiet. Charlotte looked at her husband across the table that had become over these weeks the place where they had built whatever it was they were building. The letters, the strategy, the long evenings with the lamp burning and words between them that mattered. He's going to come at you personally, she said. Yes. Are you ready for that? Ethan looked at her for a long moment. And then, with a quiet certainty that she recognized as the truest thing he had said to her since the day in her father's kitchen, when he'd held out his hand and told her she only owed him honesty. He can say what he wants about me. There is nothing in my life I've done that I'm ashamed of. Charlotte held that. Let it settle. Then Thursday, she said, we go finish this. Thursday came in hard and dry, the kind of morning that felt like it had already made up its mind about something. Charlotte was dressed before dawn. She heard Ethan moving in the other room and the sound of Joe's boots on the kitchen floor and the low, efficient exchanges of men preparing for something serious. She sat on the edge of her bed for one moment, just one, and let herself feel the full weight of what the day was going to ask of them. Then she stood up and went to face it. The county courthouse in Harlan was a single-story building with a pressed tin ceiling and wooden benches that had been worn smooth by 30 years of people sitting on them in states of anxiety and hope. By the time Charlotte and Ethan arrived at 8:30, the room was already crowded. She hadn't expected that. She should have. Word in a county like this moved faster than telegraph wire when something worth watching was about to happen. Tom Hargrove was there sitting near the front with his hat in his hands. Sarah and Martin Putnam were beside him. Mrs. Reyes sat ramrod straight in the second row, wearing her church clothes, and an expression that Charlotte read as controlled fury, held at a very precise temperature. The Garfield brothers. A dozen other faces she recognized from months of living in this county. Farmers and ranchers and tradespeople who had come because something was happening to their neighbors, and they understood the way rural people understand that what happens to your neighbor eventually comes for you. Crow was already there too, at a table on the right side of the room, flanked by 4 men in city suits, who radiated the particular expensive confidence of lawyers who charged by the quarter hour. Crow himself was composed and well-pressed, and he did not look at Ethan when they entered. That deliberate not looking told Charlotte everything about how carefully he was watching. Agent Hale sat at a side table with 2 other federal men and a substantial stack of files. Morrison had come from Denver himself. Charlotte had not expected that, and the sight of him composed and prepared at the front of the room made something in her chest settle slightly. The county judge was a man named Elias Drummond, who Charlotte knew by reputation as someone who had held his bench for 16 years by being scrupulously fair and profoundly difficult to impress. He came in without ceremony, sat down, and looked at the room over his spectacles with the air of a man who had heard everything twice and intended to get through this without embellishment. This proceeding has been called under petition to the Federal Land Office and seconded by county court order, Drummond said. We are here to review documented claims of fraudulent land title challenges, unauthorized survey activity, and financial coercion against property owners in Harlan County. This is an official record proceeding. Everything said in this room is entered. Everyone present understand that. A general murmur of assent. Good, Drummond said. Mr. Morrison, your client initiated this petition. You have the floor. Morrison stood. He was a deliberate, precise man, and he laid the case out the way a skilled builder lays a foundation, not with drama, but with such exacting care that by the time he was done, you understood that everything placed on top of it would hold. He walked through the Hargrove survey dispute document by document, date by date, demonstrating that the original survey was valid, the credentials of the surveyor confirmed, and the challenge. Crow's men had brought constituted not a legitimate legal question, but a manufactured one. He did the same for the Putnam property, for Mrs. Reyes, for the Garfield River bottom. Crow's lead lawyer, a tall man named Stearns, who had the practiced composure of someone accustomed to winning through procedure rather than truth, objected 3 times. Drummond overruled him twice, and sustained once with the brief firm efficiency of a man allocating exactly as much attention to each thing as it deserved and no more. Then Stearns rose for Crow's response. And he was good. Charlotte could see that clearly, the way a person can see a skilled opponent and respect the skill while opposing the use of it. Stearns reframed the surveys as genuine good faith concerns. He characterized Crow's acquisition efforts as legitimate development. He spoke about regional economic growth and the complexity of old land records, and the perfectly understandable confusion that arose in counties where documentation had been inconsistently maintained over decades. None of it was quite a lie. All of it was exactly half the truth, which was the most dangerous kind of dishonesty, because it was the hardest to name. Charlotte watched the room while Stearns spoke. She watched faces shift, not toward Crow, not entirely, but toward uncertainty. Toward the particular discomfort of people who want to know what to believe and are being given 2 things that can't both be true and no clear way to decide between them. Then Drummond said, Mr. Morrison, your documentation references a primary witness. Is that witness present? He is your honor, Morrison said. Call him. Morrison said, Ethan Calloway. The room moved. Not loudly. A shift, a rustle, the collective physical expression of 60 people adjusting their understanding of what they were watching. Charlotte felt it without looking around. She kept her eyes on Ethan. He stood. He walked to the front of the room with the same unhurried, unperformed steadiness he brought to everything. He sat in the witness chair. He looked at Drummond and waited. Crow, for the first time since they'd entered the room, looked directly at him. Charlotte watched Crow's face in that moment, and she saw just for a second behind the composure and the calculation something that might have been the very beginning of doubt. Morrison began. "Mr. Calloway, for the record, please state your full name and your holdings in Harlan County and the surrounding region." Ethan stated his name. Then he stated his holdings. The room went so quiet that Charlotte could hear the tin ceiling contracting in the morning heat. He listed it plainly in the same even voice he used for everything. Acreage, cattle contracts, freight partnerships, grazing rights, bank investments. The full breadth of what his father had built and what he had continued and expanded over 15 years of deliberate, patient, quiet work. Somewhere in the third minute of that list, she heard someone behind her breathe out slowly. She heard Tom Hargrove shift on his bench. She heard one of Crow's lawyers lean over and say something very low and urgent into Crow's ear, and she heard Crow's response, which was one quiet word that she couldn't make out, but whose tone she recognized as the sound of a man recalculating. When Ethan finished, Drummond looked at him over his spectacles for a long moment. Then he said simply, "Continue, Mr. Morrison." Morrison continued. He entered the banking documentation, the communications between Crow and Aldrich, the pressure applied, the technical review notice sent to the ranch. He entered 2 years of tracking Crow's methods across 3 states. He entered the Kansas transactions which Hale's team had cross-referenced with federal records and which showed a pattern of forged survey documentation that had been used in 4 counties before Harlan. Stearns objected. Again. And again. Drummond overruled with the steady, deliberate patience of a man who had already read the documentation the night before and knew what he was looking at. Then Stearns rose for cross-examination. He looked at Ethan with the focused attention of someone who has just discovered the terrain is different than the map showed and is rapidly adjusting his strategy. "Mr. Calloway," Stearns said, "you've described substantial holdings. Can you explain to this court why those holdings have not appeared in any county tax assessment, any public land registry, or any financial record available to this county for the past 15 years? Charlotte went very still. It was a good question. She had to admit that. It was the best weapon Stearns had, and he had held it for the moment. It would do the most damage, which was now after the room had heard the scope of what Ethan held, and was just beginning to feel the shape of what that meant. Ethan looked at Stearns without any change of expression. "They have appeared in every required legal filing," he said. "Federal tax returns, state land registrations, county assessment records, under the relevant property designations." He paused. "What they haven't appeared in is the public conversation of this county because I didn't put them there. A man isn't required to advertise his affairs." "But the practice of concealment, modesty isn't concealment," Ethan said. "I live within my means. I don't display what I have. That's a choice, not a crime." Stearns shifted. "You've described paying debts for neighbors, covering taxes for widows, purchasing feed and medical care for county residents, all anonymously." He let the word sit. "Can you explain the legal structure of those transactions? Because anonymous financial transfers of that scale could be characterized as charity," Ethan said. "You can characterize them as charity, because that's what they were." Someone in the room made a sound. Not a laugh. Something more complicated than a laugh. Stearns tried twice more. Each time, Ethan answered the same way, directly, without defense, without performance, with the particular unassailable quality of someone who has nothing to hide and has simply for a long time chosen not to display it. Then Stearns made his mistake. Charlotte saw it coming. A half-second before it happened, the way you sometimes see a misstep approaching and can't stop it. Stearns said, "Mr. Calloway, isn't it true that your marriage, your very recent marriage to a woman from a financially distressed family, was in fact a business arrangement designed to establish a local public face for your operations, to provide a sympathetic figure for community engagement, and thereby to advance your position in advance of this very proceeding?" The room went absolutely still. Charlotte did not move. She kept her face neutral. But something in her chest went cold and sharp, and she was aware of every person in that room turning slightly to look at her. Ethan looked at Stearns. And for the first time in the entire proceeding, something changed in his expression. Not anger. Something quieter than anger and considerably more serious. "No," he said. "That's not true. Your marriage was arranged through a mutual acquaintance, correct? A business contact of yours." "Harold Pruitt is a friend," Ethan said. "Not a business contact." "And the timing." "My wife," Ethan said, and his voice had taken on a quality Charlotte had not heard before, something that stopped Stearns mid-sentence by sheer weight of steadiness. "Came to this ranch 3 weeks before I knew Crow was in this county. She has acted in this matter on her own conscience and her own judgment. Her intelligence and her integrity are not negotiable subjects in this courtroom or anywhere else." The room was very quiet. Stearns regrouped. "Nevertheless, the arrangement. I'll tell you what the arrangement was," Ethan said. "I needed a wife with good sense and honest character. Harold Pruitt knew a woman who fit that exactly. I asked. She considered it and said yes. The reasons she said yes are her own, and she has never pretended otherwise, and I respect her for that. What she has done since has been her own decision, her own work, and her own courage." A pause. "I'd suggest you leave her out of your strategy, Mr. Stearns. It isn't working." Charlotte looked at her hands in her lap. She pressed them flat against her skirt and breathed slowly, and did not let anything show on her face. But something was happening in her chest that she hadn't budgeted for this morning and didn't entirely know what to do with. Drummond, who had been watching all of this with the expression of a man who has been doing this long enough to know when something real has just happened in his courtroom, said, "Mr. Stearns, do you have substantive questions for this witness, or are we finished?" Stearns sat down. Drummond looked at his papers. Then he looked at the federal table. "Agent Hale, your findings." Hale stood. He was a spare, factual man, and he presented his case the way a surgeon works, with precision and without sentiment. He laid out the pattern across Kansas and Nebraska, the matching methodology, the forged surveys, the financial trail that Ethan's banking documentation had finally connected. He presented the federal case that had been building for 18 months and the gap that had now been closed. Then he said, "Based on the documentation entered today, the Federal Land Office is initiating formal fraud proceedings against Silas Crow and his associated entities. We are requesting a court hold on all property transfers initiated by Crow in Harlan County pending investigation." Crow's table erupted. Stearns was on his feet. 2 of the other lawyers were talking at once. Crow himself sat completely still in the middle of the noise his people were making, and he was looking at Ethan with the focused, cold attention of a man who has just lost something he thought he had and is deciding what to do next. Drummond raised his hand. The room quieted. He was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. "The hold is granted pending federal review," he said. "Mr. Crow, you are hereby instructed to cease all acquisition activity in Harlan County, effective immediately. Any violation of that instruction will be treated as contempt of this proceeding." He looked at Stearns. "Your client is also advised that the federal inquiry extends beyond this county and this state. I would recommend he make himself available to federal investigators." Stearns said something low and urgent to Crow. Crow did not respond. He was still looking at Ethan. Then he said quietly, only loud enough for the people near him to hear, but the room had gone quiet enough that his voice carried further than he intended. "You've been waiting for this." Ethan looked back at him. "You left me no choice," he said. "You started burning people's barns." Something shifted in Crow's face. Whatever he had expected, triumph, anger, fear, he hadn't expected that. The simple, direct accountability of it. The absence of any satisfaction in Ethan's voice. Crow stood. He straightened his jacket. He nodded to his lawyers. And he walked out of that courtroom with his team around him, and the door swung closed behind them, and the room let out a breath that seemed to have been held collectively for the entire morning. Then Tom Hargrove started clapping. It wasn't a theatrical gesture. It was an old man with his hat in his hands, bringing his palms together in the plain, direct way of someone who has just seen something he thought he might not live to see. And then Martin Putnam joined him. And then the Garfield brothers. And then the room, in the unplanned, uncoordinated way of people responding to something real, was applauding, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the weight of genuine feeling behind it. Charlotte sat in her bench and did not applaud. She looked at Ethan, who had returned from the witness chair and was standing beside the table where Morrison was gathering papers, and who looked exactly the same as he had when he walked in. Steady, unhurried, unperformed, except that something around his eyes was different. Something that looked to Charlotte like a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just for the first time set it down. She went to him. She didn't say anything immediately. She stood beside him while Morrison shook his hand and Hale came over to speak briefly, and the room moved around them, and then the crowd began to thin, and then it was quieter, and she said, "You all right?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "You?" "Yes." She paused. "What you said, when Stearns went after me." "It was the truth," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "Thank you." He nodded. The way he nodded when something was settled. They were almost to the door when Mrs. Reyes stepped in front of them. She was a small woman, compact and upright. And she looked at Ethan with the direct, unsentimental assessment of someone who has earned the right to look at people that way. "You paid my taxes," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "3 years?" she said. "Yes." Mrs. Reyes looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You could have just told me." "I didn't want to embarrass you," he said. She made a sound, short, decisive, the compressed laugh of someone who has decided to find something funny rather than cry about it. "You're a strange man, Mr. Calloway." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Don't stop," she said. Then she patted his arm once firmly and walked out. Charlotte watched her go. Then she looked at Ethan. "She's right, you know. You could have told people." "It wasn't about getting credit," he said. "I know that," she said. "But they needed to know someone was there, not for pride, just to know they weren't alone in it." She paused. "There's a difference between humility and invisibility, Ethan." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was lower than usual and more careful, "You're the first person who said that to me." "You've been alone too long," she said. Not unkindly, plainly. He looked at her. That same expression she had caught before, and not known what to do with unguarded real something. That asked a question, his voice was too careful to ask. "Yes," he said. "I have." They walked out of the courthouse into the dry morning air. Cody was waiting with the wagon. Joe was with him, having ridden in from the ranch mid-morning, and the look on Joe's face when he saw them coming said everything his careful, economical manner of speaking rarely did. "Well," Cody said. "Federal proceedings," Charlotte said. "Hold on all Crow's transfers. He's done." Cody looked at the sky. Then he said, "Good," in the simple declarative tone of a man to whom the word is sufficient. They rode home. The road was the same 8 miles it had always been. But Charlotte found herself looking at it differently, not as the distance between her old life and her current situation, which was how she had measured it for weeks, but as simply the road between the courthouse and the ranch. Between the place where something important had been decided and the place where they lived. She was thinking about what Ethan had said, about his father, about wealth held quietly, about a man who had decided that character was more reliable than reputation, and had spent 15 years proving it in a way that nobody except the people it helped had ever seen. She was thinking about the barn Tom Hargrove's grandfather had built, now ash. About Mrs. Reyes, standing in the courthouse in her church clothes, paying careful attention. About Sarah Putnam pressing her fingers against her mouth to hold herself together. And she was thinking about a man who had shaken her hand in her father's kitchen and told her she owed him nothing but honesty, and who had turned out to be by any measure that actually mattered the most honest person she had encountered in her life. The wagon hit a rut. Ethan steadied it without breaking his thought, whatever his thought was, and without looking over. But his arm in the adjustment came briefly against hers, and didn't move away immediately. She didn't move away either. It was a small thing. A wagon rut, and a shoulder's width of contact, and two people who had built something together without entirely meaning to. But Charlotte had learned to notice small things. She had learned that about herself, and she had learned it more here than anywhere, that the small things were usually the ones that turned out to matter. The ranch came into view. The sagging fence. The barn that leaned. The cabin held together by habit and deliberate choice, and something that had always been there she understood now beneath the surface of the modest and the plain. She looked at it and she thought, this is mine too now. Not by contract, by choice. That was different. That was everything. Aldrich resigned from the bank the following Monday. The news came through Cody, who heard it from the hardware merchant, who heard it from the deputy, who heard it from the bank's own teller, which was the kind of information chain that meant the truth was probably somewhere in the general vicinity of what arrived. The formal version came 2 days later. A letter to the county board citing personal reasons which everyone understood meant that a man who had accepted Crow's pressure and sent a nervous young representative to serve a financial ultimatum to Ethan Calloway had decided the safest direction was away. Charlotte read the letter without comment and put it on the pile of things that were now officially resolved. There were still things that weren't. Crow's federal proceedings would take time. The families whose nerves had been shredded over the past weeks needed more than a court order to feel safe again. Tom Hargrove still didn't have a barn. The Putnams had debts that predated Crow and would outlast him. Mrs. Reyes, for all her extraordinary composure, was 61 years old and alone, and had spent 3 years of her life not knowing someone was paying her taxes. That last one was the one Charlotte kept returning to. She went to find Ethan in the barn the evening after Aldrich's resignation, and she said, "I want to do something." He looked up. What kind of something? The families that Crow targeted. The ones who are still struggling even now that he's stopped. She sat down on a hay bale across from him. "I want to do something real and tangible and visible. Not anonymous this time." Ethan set down what he was working on. He was listening the way he always listened, with his whole attention. "Hargrove needs a barn," she said. "Not just a barn. His whole operation needs to be rebuilt. The Putnams are carrying debt they've been carrying for 2 years of drought. There are at least 4 other families in similar situations." She paused. "And there are widows and workers in this county who are one bad season away from losing everything they have, and they have been for years, and there has been no structure, no real infrastructure to help them." Ethan was quiet. "You have the means," she said. "And I have," she stopped. "Thought about it honestly. I think I have the way to do it that makes it real, that makes it a community rather than a charity." "What do you mean?" "People don't want to be given things," she said. "They want to belong to something. They want to know they matter." She met his eyes. "What if we built something that they're part of a structure where neighbors support each other through bad seasons? Where the resources exist, but they're shared rather than handed down? Where Mrs. Reyes doesn't need someone secretly paying her taxes, because there's a system that makes sure she never gets to that point." Ethan looked at her for a long, slow moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since about the 3rd week," she said honestly. Something moved in his face. Something that was no longer almost a smile, or the memory of one. "Tell me more," he said. She did. They talked until midnight. And it was different from the legal strategy sessions, different from the careful information exchanges of the early weeks. It was the conversation of 2 people building something that was entirely theirs, shaped by both of them, neither of them directing, and neither of them following. At one point, Ethan said, "You know this will mean being public, being visible." The modesty was workable when it was just me. With a community structure, people will know. "Yes," Charlotte said. "They should know. Not so you get credit. So they know they can trust the structure, so they know it's real." He nodded, slowly. "There's something I should have told you weeks ago," he said. Then he paused in the particular way that meant what came next mattered. Charlotte waited. "Before the wedding," he said carefully, "when Harold first told me about your family's situation, I made some inquiries." He met her eyes directly. "Charlotte, I paid your father's debts before I ever asked him about the marriage. 2 weeks before I approached Harold with the proposal." The kitchen was very quiet. I paid them because they needed paying, he said. Not as part of any arrangement, not as leverage. I didn't know then if your father would agree. If you would agree. He stopped. It wasn't right that he was carrying that, so I cleared it. Charlotte looked at him. She thought about her father. About the knock of the debt collector's fist on the door. About the way Robert Bennett had spent a winter shrinking, losing an inch every time someone came to remind him of what he owed. And she thought about a man she had never met, who had heard about that from a mutual friend, and had quietly, without any expectation of return, taken that weight away. You paid it before you knew if I'd say yes, she said. Yes. Before there was any arrangement. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Something was moving through her, not surprise exactly, because in some way she had suspected something like this, the way you suspect the shape of a thing before you see it clearly. But feeling it confirmed was different from suspecting it. Why are you telling me now? She asked. Because you said there's a difference between humility and invisibility, he said. And I've been thinking about that since you said it. A pause. And because you deserve to know the full truth of the man you married, not the arranged version, the real one. Charlotte looked at him across the table in the lamplight in the small gray cabin that had turned out to be something entirely different from what it appeared to be. She said quietly, I think I'm beginning to. The barn went up in 11 days, not because Ethan hired it done, though he paid for every nail and every plank and every hour of labor, but because on the first morning when the Calloway ranch hands arrived at the Hargrove property with a wagon full of lumber. Tom Hargrove's nearest neighbor showed up an hour later with his 2 sons and a set of tools. And then the Garfield brothers came. And then Martin Putnam. And then 6 more men. Charlotte didn't know by name, but recognized by face from the courthouse, and from the hotel meeting, and from the long, complicated weeks that had just passed. Nobody organized it. Nobody sent word. It was the kind of thing that happens in a county when people have been frightened together long enough, and then relieved together suddenly, a release of something that comes out as action, because there is no other clean way to let it out. Charlotte stood in the Hargrove yard and watched it happen, and felt something she didn't have a precise name for. Not pride exactly. Something larger and quieter than pride. The feeling of watching people remember that they know how to take care of each other. Tom Hargrove stood beside her for a while, watching his neighbors work on his land, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, I've lived here 31 years, and I've never asked anybody for help. You didn't ask, Charlotte said. They just came. He was quiet again. That's worse almost. Harder to carry. She looked at him. No, it isn't, she said gently. That's the whole point. You don't have to carry it. That's what it means. Tom looked at the rising frame of his new barn, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically. Not with the neat emotional release of a man in a story, but the way real people shift slowly with difficulty, fighting it slightly on the way. Your husband, he said. He's been holding this county up for years, and none of us knew it. He wasn't holding you up, Charlotte said. He was making sure the floor was there when you needed to stand on it. Tom turned to look at her. He had the expression of a man reassessing something. Where did Ethan Calloway find you? He asked. Charlotte smiled. He made an inquiry, she said, and left it at that. Ethan spent those 11 days working alongside everyone else. He didn't direct. He didn't manage. He picked up tools and used them, and when the Garfield brothers' older son, a boy of about 14, who had come along and was trying to make himself useful, without quite knowing how, started fumbling with a piece of framing. Ethan simply showed him the right way to hold it, without making a moment of it, and the boy straightened up and did it correctly, and that was all. Charlotte watched that from across the yard and thought that is exactly who he is. That small moment, exactly. On the 9th day, Hale sent a letter from Denver. Charlotte read it first because Ethan was still on the Hargrove property, and she had come back to the ranch for supplies. She stood in the kitchen with the letter in her hands and read it twice. Then she sat down. Crow had attempted to liquidate his local holdings the previous week, moving to transfer deed ownership of the Delaney property and 2 other parcels he'd legally acquired before the court hold. The transfers had been blocked by the federal order. His lawyers had filed a challenge to the jurisdiction of the proceeding, which Hale's office had answered with an expanded filing that now formally connected the Kansas fraud to the Nebraska operations and to 4 additional counties in 2 other states. The federal case was no longer just Harlan County. It was everything. 3 states, a decade of operations, a pattern of fraud that Hale's letter described as one of the most extensive land acquisition schemes his office had documented in the region, and the gap that had made the case unprovable for 18 months. The financial trail, the banking documentation, the specific connection between Crow's manufactured legal pressure and the money that moved as a result had been closed by Ethan's records. By Ethan's records that had been sitting quietly in Morrison's files for 2 years while Crow worked his way across the plains. Charlotte sat with that for a moment. She thought about a man who had built a hidden fortune over 40 years and then spent 15 more holding it carefully, invisibly, patiently. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood something about how power works and what greed does when it sees itself reflected, how it reaches, how it overreaches, how it eventually destroys itself if you don't give it what it wants before it's ready to be stopped. She thought his father taught him patience, and patience had done what confrontation couldn't. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went back to the Hargrove property. She handed it to Ethan without comment. He read it beside the half-built barn with sawdust on his boots and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and when he finished, he folded it the same way she had and put it in his breast pocket and went back to work. Later on the ride home, she said, "You knew it was bigger than Harlan County." "I suspected," he said. "That's why you waited. You weren't just protecting yourself. You were waiting until you had enough to end it completely." He was quiet for a moment. "A partial stop doesn't stop a man like Crow," he said. "It just teaches him to be more careful. I needed enough to make it final." Charlotte looked at the road ahead. "You could have told me that," she said. "Earlier." "Yes," he said. "I could have." A pause. "I wasn't sure yet how much you wanted to be part of it." She turned to look at him. "And now?" He met her eyes briefly before returning to the road. "Now I'm sure," he said. She faced forward again. The ranch came into view. The sagging fence that she had long since stopped seeing as evidence of anything except a choice. The cabin that was small and plain and had become without her entirely noticing home. "We need to talk about the community structure," she said. "I've been working out the details." "Tell me," he said. She told him. For the rest of the ride and through supper and into the evening, she laid it out not as a charitable fund, not as Ethan's money distributed quietly through anonymous channels, but as a formal cooperative structure. Member families, shared resources, a modest reserve that could cover tax shortfalls and medical emergencies and bad harvest seasons. Decisions made collectively. Contributions proportional to capacity. Leadership rotating among members so no single person or family held permanent authority over the rest. She had thought about this carefully, and she said so. She had thought about what it meant to need help and not want to be diminished by needing it. And she had thought about what it meant to give help without creating dependence. And she had arrived at a structure that she believed did both. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The reserve. You're thinking I seed it." "Yes, substantially. Enough that it can sustain itself through normal bad seasons without needing constant infusion." She paused. "But anonymously this time would be wrong. People need to know the foundation is sound. They need to trust the structure, which means they need to know what's under it." "They'll know it's my money," he said. "Some of them will resist that. Some of them will," she agreed. "And we'll have the conversation with those people honestly and let them decide. But I think most of them, after everything that's happened, trust you enough." She looked at him. "You've been their floor for years. They didn't know it. Now they do. That changes things." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And you, what's your role in this?" She had thought about this too. "I run it," she said simply. "Day to day, the relationships, the decisions, the conversations with families who are too proud to ask for what they need." She paused. "I'm good at that. And I'm..." She stopped, honest with herself for a moment. I need something of my own here. Something I built. Not just something I married into. The words landed in the quiet room. Ethan looked at her with that expression she had come to know, the one that was fully present and fully careful at the same time. Yes, he said. You should have that. She nodded once. Good, she said. Then we're agreed. The structure took shape over the following 6 weeks, and it moved faster than Charlotte had expected, because it turned out that people who have been frightened into community tend to stay in community after the fear is gone, if someone gives them a reason to. She went to each family personally. She sat at kitchen tables and had honest conversations and did not use soft language or comfortable evasions. She told the Putnams exactly what the cooperative would do and what it wouldn't do, and what would be expected of them and what they could expect in return. She sat with Mrs. Reyes for 2 hours one afternoon, and the older woman asked hard questions, and Charlotte answered every one of them straight, and at the end, Mrs. Reyes said, "All right, what do I sign and where?" She sat with the Garfield brothers, who were skeptical in the specific way of men who have built things themselves and are suspicious of anything that comes without visible cost. She didn't try to talk them out of the skepticism. She just laid out the facts and said, "You don't have to join, but your neighbors will, and the structure will be stronger with you in it. Think about it." They thought about it for 4 days, and then showed up at the ranch on a Thursday morning and said they were in. Tom Hargrove joined without hesitation. His barn was up. His land was secure. He was a man who paid his debts. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Your experience," Charlotte said. "You've been working this county for 30 years. When someone's struggling before they say so, you know it. I need people like you who can see it early." Tom straightened slightly. 31 years, and no one had ever named that quality in him as something worth having. "I can do that," he said. The founding meeting of the Harlan County Land and Neighbor Cooperative took place on a Wednesday evening in October, 6 months after Charlotte had signed her name on a marriage contract in her father's kitchen and ridden away with a man she barely knew. 32 families sent representatives. The Harlan Hotel meeting room, the same room where Crow had stood and spoken his careful half-truths to a frightened audience, was full again, but with an entirely different quality. Not the anxious, assessing silence of people deciding what to believe. The louder, more disorganized sound of people who already know where they stand and are talking about what to do next. Charlotte stood at the front of the room. Ethan sat in the second row, which was exactly where he belonged, and she knew that, and he knew it, and neither of them needed to discuss it. She called the meeting to order, and it was, she would think later, the first time in her life she had stood in front of a room full of people who were there because of something she had built, rather than something she had been forced into. The difference was physical. She felt it in the way she stood. She went through the structure, the reserve, the decision process, the expectations. She answered questions, sharp ones, practical ones, the kind that came from people who had been burned before and needed to understand exactly what they were agreeing to. She answered every single one directly and without evasion, and when she didn't know the answer to something, she said so and said who to ask. Halfway through, Sarah Putnam raised her hand and said, "Who decides when a family qualifies for support? I don't want a committee of neighbors knowing my financial situation." It was the best question anyone asked all evening. Charlotte had prepared for it. "A 2-person review," she said. "1 person you choose. 1 person the cooperative appoints. Nobody else sees the details unless you authorize it. The decision is theirs, and it's binding." She paused. "We built this so people can get help without being humiliated by needing it. That's not a side goal. That's the whole point." Sarah nodded, sat down. Afterward, when the room had emptied, and the last families had headed home into the October dark, Charlotte and Ethan helped stack the chairs, which was not something they needed to do, but which felt right. Somehow the simple physical work of putting a room back to rights after something important had happened in it. When the last chair was stacked, Ethan said, "You know what you built tonight." "The beginning of something," she said. "Not the thing itself, the beginning. That's the hard part," he said. "I know." She looked at him across the neat rows of stacked chairs. "It's also the part I'm good at." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "You are." They walked out together. 3 weeks later, a reporter came from Denver. His name was Graves, and he was writing about the federal fraud proceedings against Crow, which had continued to expand and had become a story of enough regional significance that his paper had taken notice. He arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning and introduced himself to Charlotte, who was in the kitchen garden, considerably more established now with a second bed she'd added in September, and asked if he could speak with Mr. Calloway. "You can speak with both of us," Charlotte said, and brought him inside. Graves was a quick, observant man, the kind of reporter who asked questions that sounded general and were actually specific. He asked about the hearing, about the cooperative, about the land holdings and the years of anonymity and the deliberate modesty of the ranch. He asked his questions with genuine curiosity, not the performative kind, and Charlotte found herself answering him more fully than she'd expected to. Then he turned to Ethan and asked, "Mr. Calloway, you've held a very substantial fortune for 15 years without drawing any attention to it. Most men in your position would have—" He paused, searching for the diplomatic phrasing. "Lived differently," Ethan said. "Yes. Why didn't you—" Ethan was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was actually thinking about the question, rather than reaching for the prepared answer. "My father used to say that money tells people who they think you are," he said. "Character tells them who you really are." A pause. "I wanted to know what I was made of before I let anyone else decide." Graves wrote that down. Then he looked up. "And now that it's public." Ethan looked at Charlotte briefly. Something passed between them, not a look with a clear message, but the kind that carries weight precisely because it doesn't need one. "Now it's different," Ethan said. "I have a reason to let it be seen." Graves looked between them. He was a perceptive man. He understood what he was looking at. He closed his notebook. "One more question," he said. "Off the record, if you prefer." He looked at Charlotte. "When you married him, you didn't know any of this." "No," she said. And now, Charlotte looked at the man sitting across the table from her, the man who had shaken her hand in her father's kitchen and told her she owed him nothing but honesty, who had been the floor under people's feet for 15 years without asking for recognition, who had sat across from a federal investigator and answered every question directly because there was nothing in his life he'd done that he was ashamed of, who had paid her father's debts before he knew if she would say yes, who had told Stearns in a courtroom full of people that her intelligence and integrity were not negotiable. She looked at him, and she thought about the signed contract that had felt like a sentence, and the 8-mile road that had felt like exile, and the plain silver ring that had turned out to belong to someone's history, and to have enough weight in it to anchor something real. "Now," she said, "I know exactly who I married, and I would sign that paper again." Ethan looked at her. Not the almost smile, not the memory of one. The thing itself, quiet and direct and entirely real. "So would I," he said. Graves left an hour later. Charlotte walked him to his horse, and he said, turning before he mounted, "That's a good story, Mrs. Calloway." "It's a true one," she said. "Those are the best kind." He rode out. She stood and watched him go. Behind her she heard Ethan come to the door, and she heard him stop there, and she knew without turning that he was watching the same road. She stood for a moment in the October morning in the dry Colorado air that had already begun to carry the first edge of winter in it, and she thought about a drought that had broken half the farms in eastern Colorado, and a faded cream dress, and a church with 11 people in it, and a man who had tipped his hat in a way that didn't make sense. She thought about everything she had not known, and everything she had learned, and everything she had built, and she thought about the particular shape her life had taken, not the shape she had expected, not the shape anyone who had watched her sign that contract would have predicted, but a shape that was entirely and specifically hers. The sagging fence still sagged. The cabin was still small and plain. The road was still 8 miles of Colorado dirt, but she had a kitchen garden with 2 beds, now, and 32 families who trusted her enough to let her help them, and a husband who paid debts before he knew if they'd lead anywhere, and a cooperative that was right now just a beginning and would be something real by spring. She turned and walked back toward the house. Ethan held the door. She walked through it. Some bargains made in desperation turn out against all reasonable expectation to be the most honest thing two people ever agreed to. And what Charlotte Bennet had signed her name to in her father's kitchen on a February evening turned out not to be the end of something, but the beginning of the only life that was ever going to be large enough to hold everything she actually was.